Sairam sir.
Sairam.
Sairam sir.
Sairam sir.
Mrs. Fitzgerald, Mrs. Pearson rebukes Cyril, J.B. Priestley Bonnet. J.B. Priestley, born in Yorkshire in England, is known in the army during World War I. He studied literature at Cambridge University. On graduating, he became a freelance writer. Priestley's repertoire includes a rich collection of books across genres, ranging from science fiction to social history. Many of his works contain strong political messages and generated controversy when published. He was fascinated with the theory that time was non-linear and used this as a plot device in several plays. He achieved tremendous success with his novel The Good Companions. Angel Pavement was also well received. His plays too were quite popular, including his most notable play, An Inspector Calls, and comedies such as When We Are Married. He was a proficient radio speaker too, noted for his radio program during World War II. Priestley's play, Mother's Day, provides a humorous and satirical perspective on the role of a mother in a family. The mother in the play, Mrs. Pearson, is a meek housewife who is taken for granted by her family. Through a magical personality switch, Mrs. Pearson's neighbor, Mrs. Fitzgerald, teaches the family a lesson in respect and appreciation that enables Mrs. Pearson to establish her role as a valuable and loved family member. Here is a summary of the play Mother's Day by J.B. Priestley. The play opens with Mrs. Pearson. Mrs. Fitzgerald has just predicted Mrs. Pearson's future and not let them treat her like a doormat. Mrs. Pearson responds that she loves them too much, even though they are selfish. She says that she keeps dropping hints, but Mrs. Fitzgerald urges her to be more forceful. Mrs. Pearson is doubtful that she can do it. Also, she does not know how to go about it. Mrs. Fitzgerald, who knows some magic, suggests that they exchange bodies. She would then deal with Mrs. Pearson's family. Mrs. Pearson seems bewildered, but agrees to try it out. Both women sit across the table, holding hands and staring at each other, while Mrs. Fitzgerald starts chanting. They collapse, but wake up again, having exchanged personalities. Mrs. Pearson now looks bold and confident, while Mrs. Fitzgerald seems nervous and unsure. Mrs. Pearson, speaking like Mrs. Fitzgerald, claims that she can deal with the Pearson family. Mrs. Fitzgerald is alarmed that they might not be able to change back. Mrs. Pearson reassures Mrs. Fitzgerald, advising her to go to her place for a while and then return to see how things are going. Mrs. Fitzgerald leaves, and the confident-looking Mrs. Pearson starts playing a game of cards. At this point, Doris, Mrs. Pearson's daughter, enters, demanding that her mother iron her dress. She is shocked when she sees her mother smoking, but Mrs. Pearson responds calmly that there is no law against smoking. Doris is even more startled when Mrs. Pearson declares her intention to go out in the evening for a meal alone. Doris then asks her mother for tea. When Mrs. Pearson says that there is no tea for Doris, Doris gets angry. She grumbles that she worked hard all day and the least she can expect is tea. Mrs. Pearson retorts that Doris doesn't work half as hard as her mother does at home. Annoyed, Doris again orders her mother to iron her yellow dress as she plans to go out that evening with Charlie Spence. Mrs. Pearson proceeds to mock Charlie until Doris runs out crying. Mrs. Pearson's son, Cyril, enters the room. He curtly demands tea and inquires if Mrs. Pearson has put his things out. Mrs. Pearson calmly replies that she hasn't and declares that she has decided not to do any such work anymore. Cyril is shocked and surprised at the changes in his mother. Doris returns with red-rimmed eyes. As soon as Mrs. Pearson leaves the room to get herself a drink, the siblings start discussing their mother's unusual behavior. Doris wonders if she has suffered a concussion. Then they wonder what would happen if she behaves in the same manner towards their father. Mrs. Pearson re-enters with a bottle. When both children claim to be tired after working 8 hours a day, Mrs. Pearson says that she too has worked 8 hours. She then declares that she, like everyone else, will only work 40 hours a week and not on weekends. The siblings are alarmed. Cyril leaves to make himself something to eat. Doris asks her mother if she is serious about not doing anything over the weekends. Mrs. Pearson says that she might do some cooking, provided she is thanked for it. Mrs. Pearson even declares that she might go somewhere for the weekend. Doris is stunned and tries to gather more information. Mrs. Pearson retorts that she is older and able to handle herself better than Doris. Doris is again reduced to tears when George Pearson, Mrs. Pearson's husband, enters. George conveys his displeasure on seeing Mrs. Pearson drinking. Mrs. Pearson's calm reply that she wants to drink amazes George further. He informs her that he will not have tea as he's going to his club, and is annoyed when Mrs. Pearson tells him that there is no tea anyway. Mrs. Pearson ridicules him for being angry about the lack of something he does not want. She goes on to say how people at the club call him Pompey Pearson because he's so pompous. Cyril enters at this point with some food, and George questions him about the nickname. Cyril admits that it is true, and George leaves stunned. Cyril chides Mrs. Pearson for hurting his father's feelings. Mrs. Pearson responds angrily that Cyril's opinions did not matter. After all he did was spend too much time and money on races and the like. At this moment, Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is really Mrs. Pearson, returns to the house. Mrs. Pearson rebukes Cyril for his rude behavior towards Mrs. Fitzgerald, and Cyril leaves in a huff. Mrs. Fitzgerald asks Mrs. Pearson how things are going. The latter assures the former that soon the family will respect Mrs. Pearson. George returns. He raves about being called Pompey Pearson and complains about Doris sobbing upstairs. Mrs. Pearson tells George to behave himself in front of guests, but George loses his temper and asks if Mrs. Pearson has lost her mind and even declares that she must be drunk. Much to George's bewilderment, Mrs. Fitzgerald gets upset on hearing all this. Doris returns to the room and is annoyed when Mrs. Fitzgerald asks about her friend. But Mrs. Pearson orders her to speak respectfully or leave the room. Things get into quite a tangle with George, Doris, Mrs. Pearson and Mrs. Fitzgerald all talking, and Mrs. Fitzgerald trying to defend the Pearson family. Suddenly, Mrs. Fitzgerald gets up and asks everyone to leave her and Mrs. Pearson alone. Mrs. Fitzgerald now pleads with Mrs. Pearson that they should switch back to their original personalities because the Pearson family seems to have had enough. As before, the two women link hands while chanting. When it is done, the two women regain their authentic personalities. Mrs. Fitzgerald advises Mrs. Pearson not to be lenient and not to apologize, or things would be back to square one. Mrs. Fitzgerald suggests that they test this and asks Mrs. Pearson what she wants to do that evening. The families call back in, and they walk in looking apprehensively at Mrs. Pearson. Mrs. Pearson tells them that they will all have a family game of rummy, and then the children would make supper while the parents chat. George and Cyril agree, but Doris hesitates, provoking a sharp query from Mrs. Pearson. Doris hastily agrees. Mrs. Fitzgerald leaves as the family gathers around Mrs. Pearson. The main characters are Mrs. Fitzgerald, Mrs. Pearson, Doris Pearson, Cyril Pearson, and George Pearson. Click each label to learn more about the characters. Mrs. Fitzgerald is a self-assured, confident woman. This is apparent from her behavior as well as her opinion about the family taking advantage of Mrs. Pearson's kind nature. Her confidence is apparent in the cool and calm way she handles the aggression and anger of the Pearsons without getting flustered. Mrs. Fitzgerald not only holds strong opinions but is also a helpful friend, as illustrated when she exchanges places with Mrs. Pearson to teach the other Pearsons a lesson in respect and proper behavior. However, she is quite sarcastic and not very sensitive to the feelings of others. She speaks rather rudely to George and Doris in front of Mrs. Pearson. As Mrs. Pearson, she even threatens to slap George if he shouted at her. There is an air of mystery that hangs around Mrs. Fitzgerald that is demonstrated by her knowledge of not only fortune-telling, but also her apparent ability to switch personalities easily. Now let us examine the play closely. The main characters are Mrs. Fitzgerald, Mrs. Pearson, Doris Pearson, Cyril Pearson, and George Pearson. Click each label to learn more about the characters. Mrs. Pearson is a generally pleasant person, but too docile in her behavior. Her docility is clear from the way she allows herself to be ordered around by her family without raising any protest. It is also evident in her reluctance to confront her family. However, she eventually stands up to Mrs. Fitzgerald when she feels that Mrs. Fitzgerald is humiliating her family. Mrs. Pearson is clearly nervous and unsure about most things, unlike Mrs. Fitzgerald. This is evident in her mannerisms as well as her reluctance to speak to her family about their behavior. Even when she expresses her opinions, she comes across as fearful. Once she and Mrs. Fitzgerald exchange personalities, she gets extremely worried that she would be stuck as Mrs. Fitzgerald forever, and even suggests that they undo the personality switch. Doris and Cyril are Mrs. Pearson's children. They are self-centered and pampered. Both children not only expect their mother to cook for them, but also mend and iron their clothes when required. They take their mother for granted and fail to appreciate the work she does at home. Both of them also think that the work they do is far more important and tiring than the work their mother does. George is Mrs. Pearson's husband. He is self-centered and arrogant. This is apparent from the casual manner in which he informs his wife that he plans to have supper alone at his club and will not want tea. He also prefers to spend time at the club rather than with his wife. His arrogance is so apparent that he is known as Pompey Pearson at his club. Like his children, George also takes his wife for granted and fails to appreciate her goodness. George is also quite unreasonable as he gets annoyed that there is no tea, even though he does not want tea. Now let us examine the play closely. The setting of the play is a well-furnished living room in a suburban semi-detached house in London around 1950. The family setting is that of a reasonably well-off family in which the mother manages the household and the father and grown-up children have jobs. The social setting gives us a glimpse of the attitude towards women, specifically homemakers in 1950s. The central theme of the story is the status of the mother in the modern family. The play illustrates how the role of the mother who takes care of the house is not appreciated. This is clear from the manner in which Mrs. Pearson is taken for granted by the rest of the family. The children assume that their mother will always be available to cook for them or to mend and iron their clothes whenever they expect her to. They order their mother around in a rude and aggressive manner, expecting her to obey without complaining. Mr. Pearson and whose opinions and interests don't matter. An important secondary theme in the Gerald not behaved indifferently, the family would never have acknowledged the importance of Mrs. Pearson,
When did we lose connection? I'm asking how long ago did we lose connection?
So 5 minutes
So when
approx.
discussion about theme was going on.
Yes.
I
So when
couldn't get.
discussion about theme was going on.
Discussion about theme was going on. Okay, and theme, that means analysis of the play was after theme. You did not see the analysis.
Yes,
No,
sir.
sir.
Analysis of the play. Okay. Thankfully, we could see everything. I muted myself and I kept my camera closed so that the connectivity doesn't get affected. And probably because of that, we could see the summary completely. We could see the description of all four characters, actually five, but in the list there were four. So the description of characters was also seen and themes were discussed. Probably not completely. No problem. I'll share a few more things later on. But mainly, what I wanted to share or to show is that you should go through the complete story once again. You should know about the characters, what characters are, and what actually happens in the story because there are complications. Even when you read this, you will find that sometimes at one point of time, Mrs. Fitzgerald is Mrs. Fitzgerald. At another point of time, when narrator is using Mrs. Fitzgerald as a speaker's name, at that time, Mrs. Fitzgerald is actually body of Fitzgerald or the soul of Fitzgerald. We get confused sometimes. Those who have gone through it, those who have read it, will agree with this that there was a confusion. Sometimes you were not able to find that the speaker is Mrs. Fitzgerald physically or Mrs. Fitzgerald's soul in Mrs. Pearson's body, where the names are written with the dialogue. Sometimes at some point of time it causes confusion, it creates confusion. Do you agree it happened in the play, in the script, and in the
Yes, sir.
Yes,
lesson
sir.
when you read in the textbook?
Yes, sir.
Did it happen or was it clear when you were reading?
Yes, sir.
What, yes, sir? It was clear, yes, sir, or there was some confusion?
Sir, confusion was there.
I don't understand what is this yes for. चलो ठीक है. Your yes is causing confusion for me. Now, I'm sharing one more screen that also is of Tata Class. Ah, can you see this on screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I, I'll share this PDF on class WhatsApp group. And what I expect is that you will go through the complete PDF, the complete explanation and analysis and everything. Specifically, I wish you check these characters once. They have been described here nicely, and that will be useful for you. You can add your own ideas to it later on, but you will get some good idea from here. They have described nicely. So all these characters have been described and explained here. So specifically pay attention to this part. Go through the entire PDF. Now analysis which we missed perhaps. Okay. In analysis, as you said, that the key themes were being discussed, so it is all here. Just go through it once again. Setting when you were in class 10th and even when you were in class 9th, when we discussed about the features of a story, there I quite in details explained what setting is. Okay. So the setting of this story is, see, the household has been described. Where is it? The locality has been described. It is a suburban area. It's a semi-detached house. The place is London. The time also has been given here. Okay. And it's a well-off family. Not very rich, not very prosperous, but not poor as well. And what is importantly to be paid attention on is that the mother manages the household. She is a housewife and she stays at home and she does everything at home, manages it completely for everybody. And as a result of that, everybody starts dominating her. Okay. This all is there. Children and father, they are busy with their profession. They all are in their jobs. And this is the reason why they have started dominating and expecting all work done, all assistance done by mother only because she is the one who stays at home. Rest everyone goes out. And those who start going out for a job, whether they do real hard work or not, whether they are actually busy or not, but once they get into a job, they start developing an attitude that they are very busy, and when they return they are tired and they start demanding. And once the mother starts fulfilling the demands, they start taking her for granted. And the demand that begins with a request in the beginning later on turns out to be orders, commands. So this all has been depicted in this theme. When I share, just go through it once again. That's it. Now, out of all this that we have seen that day, also we saw a short video. Today, we saw the detailed explanation in the video from Tata Class Edge, and this PDF is also there that you have gone through, at least seen once. Out of all this, and especially those who have tried to read the play, as I said in the beginning, that we'll have to go through this once again. We'll have to look at this play thoroughly because it needs an explanation. So after having watched the videos and trying to understand and trying to read and everything that you have done from your side, or what I have done here on the screen, if you wish to discuss any particular portion, any particular thing that is not clear to you, please go ahead. Start asking questions. Discussion will be a better explanation.
So after so the when they exchange their souls, um, नाम तो भूल ही गई.
हाँ, मिसेस
Just
पियर्सन
a
and मिसेस
second.
फिट्जरॉल्ड.
Yes, sir. So in the play, Shravani and Neha will be playing. Sir, how they will be sir, कैसे पूछूं?
पूछ ले, कैसे भी पूछ ले, जैसे पूछना है.
सर हाँ तो सर जो दूसरी वाली थी वो अपने उसने अपने घर जाके फिर क्या किया होगा?
ओके.
लाइक उनने अपने
हाँ ठीक, समझ गया.
कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स बदल लिए थे.
समझ गया, समझ गया, समझ गया, बिल्कुल समझ गया. आई अंडरस्टूड. It's good that you thought this. I think even narrator wouldn't have thought. The writer wouldn't even have thought what would Mrs. Fitzgerald do when she goes home.
Yes, sir.
Because in the body of Fitzgerald, it is Mrs. Pearson. So whatever she will do will be the thought of Mrs. Pearson in Mrs. Fitzgerald's house. So, because
Yes,
Mrs.
sir.
Fitzgerald is an old lady, even if she is staying at Mrs. Pearson's house here in the main setting, because she is bold, she is smart enough, she will be able to manage. But because this is a simpleton, Mrs. Pearson, who got into Mrs. Fitzgerald's body and goes out to her house, who is a simple lady, would probably find it very difficult to adjust and she won't understand what to do over there. This is what is your concern, right?
Yes, sir.
Good. Because writer has not written anything, to your question, my answer will be completely my imagination. Agreed?
Yes, sir.
Whatever I say will not be the true explanation. Whatever I say will just be out of my own imagination, my own creativity. जो मैं मनगढ़ंत तरीके से बता सकता हूँ, तुझे बता दूंगा. Agreed?
Okay, sir.
यही होगा ना? होगा कि नहीं ऐसा? Because there is nothing as such given in the story, in the play written by the writer. तो मैं आपके इस क्वेश्चन का क्या आंसर दूंगा, आप बताओ. मैं अपनी कल्पना से कुछ ना कुछ मन गढ़ंत बातें गढ़ के और आपको बता दूंगा. यही होगा.
Yes, sir.
ठीक है. तो अब बाकी लोग तो जो कर रहे हैं वो कर रहे हैं. स्वस्तिका नायक के लिए एक असाइनमेंट है जो उसको आज कंप्लीट करना है. कल संडे है, कल भी आराम से टाइम ले सकती है स्वस्तिका. मंडे को वो शेयर करेगी हमारे साथ. आपको अपने इमेजिनेशन से लिखना है कि मिसेस फिट्जजेराल्ड ने, जो कि एक्चुअली अंदर से मिसेस पियर्सन है, उसने मिसेस फिट्जजेराल्ड के घर में जाके क्या किया हो।
यस सर।
कोई नहीं जानता, आप भी नहीं जानते, मैं भी नहीं जानता, सब कल्पना है ना, सब माया है। तो आप अपने मन से कुछ लिखो, कहानी, कथा, और आप हमें बताओ कि क्या किया होगा।
यस सर।
ओके, ठीक है। चलो देखो, सीधी सी बात यह है कि वहां जाके पहली बात तो ये कि शी वुडंट हैव बीन कंफर्टेबल, डेफिनेटली, है ना। एक स्मार्ट वुमन होती, थोड़ी सी बोल्ड होती, तो वो कुछ करती, एडजस्ट कर लेती, लेकिन क्योंकि वो थोड़ी ऐसी है, डर जाती है, तो वहां जाके वो कंफर्टेबल तो नहीं रहेगी। और जब कोई पर्सन कंफर्टेबल नहीं होता है तो वो क्या करता है, बताओ क्या करता है। क्या वो फैमिली मेंबर्स के साथ में इंटरेक्ट करता है, या क्या वो एक अपने रूम में जाके या एक लोनली कॉर्नर में जाके शांति से अकेले बैठा रहता है या बैठ जाता
सर रूम में जाके शांति से अकेला बैठा रहता
है ना। तो सबसे ज्यादा पॉसिबिलिटी तो इसी बात की कि वो गई होगी, और डेफिनेटली उसके फैमिली में भी कुछ लोग होंगे, ठीक है। अगर हम ऐसा एक्सपेक्ट करते हैं कि वो उसकी फैमिली में भी कुछ लोग होंगे, तो वो ज्यादा लोगों से बात नहीं करेगी, क्योंकि उसको पता ही नहीं है कि मुझे कैसे बात करना है। तो वो सीधे जाएगी, अपने रूम में जाएगी, और शायद शी विल नॉट फॉल asleep, बट शी विल प्रिटेंड टू बी स्लीपिंग। दिस इज द सेफेस्ट थिंग टू डू। जब आपके पास कोई रेस्पॉन्सेज नहीं हो, आपके पास कोई तरीका नहीं है लोगों के साथ इंटरेक्ट करने का, तो इवन इफ यू आर नॉट स्लीपिंग, गो प्रिटेंड स्लीपिंग एंड जस्ट लॉक योर सेल्फ इन अ रूम। तो सबसे ज्यादा तो पॉसिबिलिटी इसी बात की कि उसने यही किया होगा। और किसी ने कोशिश की होगी फिर भी उससे बात करने की, तो व्हाट विल शी डू, बताओ। एक एक स्टीरियोटाइप्ड आंसर है।
है। मेरे
क्या
सर
बोला?
में दर्द है।
मेरे से बात मत करो अभी, मेरे सर में दर्द है, मुझे अकेले छोड़ दो, है ना, मुझे थोड़ा आराम करने दो। जब भी हमसे कोई बोलता है ना मेरे सर में दर्द है, चले जाओ उधर अभी, अ, उसका मतलब ये है कि दैट पर्सन डजंट वांट टू टॉक टू यू। तो शायद उसके भी सर में दर्द होने लगा होगा घर जाने के पहले से ही, हो रहा होगा उसके सर में तो। ठीक है, तो स्वस्तिका, आप अपने इमेजिनेशन से एक कथा लिखो और हमें
यस
बताना,
सर।
ठीक है। ओके, चलो ये तो एक वैसे ही एक क्वेश्चन उसने पूछ लिया, आउट ऑफ क्रिएटिविटी एंड आउट ऑफ क्यूरियोसिटी। बट मैं बोल रहा हूँ कि आपने जो ये पूरा लेसन है, इसके अंदर कोई स्पेसिफिक पार्ट है जो आपको कंफ्यूज कर रहा है, या कोई स्पेसिफिक स्टेटमेंट है जिसका एक्सप्लेनेशन चाहिए, प्लीज टॉक अबाउट दैट। इट्स ऑलरेडी 3:41, लास्ट 2 minutes।
सर
हम्म
सर after exchanging their bodies, Mrs. Fitzgerald said that she don't know how to again exchange their bodies. So how they again change their body after all that.
सी, द वे दे डिड इट फॉर द फर्स्ट टाइम, भाई उसको रिटर्न करना नहीं आता है, ठीक है, रिटर्न करना नहीं आता, है ना। आप अ, आप कैरम खेल रहे हो, आप कैरम खेल रहे हो, व्हाट इज डक ऑफ एडिनबर्ग, शी इज आस्किंग। आपको यहां से जब आप स्ट्राइक करते हो, ठीक है, तो आपको ये नहीं आता कि मुझे ऐसे स्ट्राइक करना है कि ये वहां जाए, ठीक है, उस एंड पे हिट करे, और वो जो रीबाउंड शॉट होता है वो वापस इधर आए। वो आपको नहीं आता, ठीक है ना, ये नहीं आता, लेकिन आपको एक साइड से दूसरे एंड तक मारना तो आता है। तो डोंट कंसिडर इट एज समथिंग डन फॉर द सेकेंड टाइम। जब वो दोबारा आई थी तब वो वही वाला जो मैजिक स्पेल उसको आता था, जो उसको फर्स्ट टाइम बोलना था, अगर फ्रॉम द अदर एंड, क्योंकि वो सोल दूसरे बॉडी में तो उसी की है, तो फ्रॉम देयर इफ शी डज द सेम स्पेल वंस अगेन, तो शी कैन वंस अगेन इंटरचेंज। ये तो कोई वैसे भी एक यूजलेस और कोई सेंसिबल स्टेटमेंट नहीं दिख रहा मुझे कि जिसमें ये कहा जाए कि उसको वापस करना नहीं आता, ठीक है। ये जो हमने देखा था इनविजिबल मैन, नहीं अभी आप लोगों ने नहीं पढ़ा इनविजिबल मैन, पढ़ा था ना शायद 10th में था, एक पोर्शन था उसका ना इनविजिबल मैन का, फुटप्रिंट विदाउट फीट था ना उसका, एक छोटा सा पोर्शन था, पूरा प्लेन, पूरी नॉवेल नहीं थी, पूरी नॉवेल 12th में थी, आप लोगों के उसमें एक पार्ट था। तो वो जो साइंटिस्ट था उसने एक कुछ केमिकल, जो भी उसने मेडिसिन या जो भी हम बोल रहे हैं उसको, उसने बना लिया था फॉर्मूला टू मेक हिमसेल्फ इनविजिबल, लेकिन उसके पास उसका वो सॉल्यूशन नहीं बन पाया था जिससे ही कैन मेक हिमसेल्फ वंस अगेन विजिबल। तो वो तो एक चैलेंज था, बट यहाँ पे तो केवल सोल इंटरचेंज करने वाला स्पेल है, तो अगर उसको इस बॉडी से इस बॉडी में जाने का स्पेल आता है, तो इस बॉडी से इस बॉडी में जाने के लिए भी उसको वही करना था, ठीक है। तो दैट वाज nothing very sensible when it was said like this, okay, that could be done, or it was done at last, it was done at last, if it was not possible how could she have done, है ना, तो वो तो हो ही गया था। खैर now it is 3:44, कुछ क्वेश्चंस निकाल के रखो डिस्कशन के लिए, और अगर आपके पास क्वेश्चंस नहीं है तो मैं ये एक्सपेक्ट करूंगा कि आप लोगों को ये सब कुछ अच्छे से क्लियर हो चुका है, तो फिर हम नेक्स्ट क्लास में नेक्स्ट लेसन डिस्कस करेंगे, ठीक है। अगर आप कुछ क्वेश्चंस पूछोगे तो डेफिनेटली हम पूरा पीरियड इसके लिए स्पेंड करेंगे, और नहीं तो फिर हम नेक्स्ट लेसन पे पहुंच जाएंगे, ओके। सो साईराम
Sir, I asked a question.
हाँ 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 हाँ, हु आस्क्ड अ क्वेश्चन, रूमिशा, अच्छा इसने उसमें डाला था डक ऑफ एडिनबर्ग, कहाँ पे आया था बेटा ये?
Sir, chapter में.
अरे यार मुझे भी पता है चैप्टर में ही आया होगा, है ना, तू कोई मूवी में से तो पूछ नहीं रही होगी। किस किस एरिया में आया था, किस जगह पे आया था, किस इंस्टेंस के पास में आया था, थोड़ा सा ऐसे बता दो, क्योंकि राइट नाउ आई डोंट हैव टेक्स्ट बुक और एनीथिंग विद मी, तो चैप्टर में ही आया होगा तभी तूने पूछा है, किधर आया था, थोड़ा सा ऐसे मुझे बता कहाँ पे उसने बोला था ये, तो कॉन्टेक्स्ट पता चलेगा ना, तो फिर मैं तुम्हें जल्दी से बता दूंगा। रूमिशा, मैं
Sir,
लेसन
just a
खोलने की
second.
कोशिश कर रहा हूँ, पर मैं लेसन खोलूंगा तब तक तुम लोग मुझे बता दोगे तो ज्यादा अच्छा रहेगा, क्योंकि मैं लेसन ढूंढूंगा, इसमें पीडीएफ खोलूंगा, फिर उसके बाद में मैं आपको कुछ बता पाऊंगा।
Sir, when Mrs. Fitzgerald, who was actually Mrs. Pearson,
हाँ
came to Mrs. Fitzgerald, who was having who was Mrs. Pearson, when the soul got exchanged. George came, and then Mrs. Fitzgerald, who was Mrs. Pearson, said him George, and Mrs. Pearson, who was Fitzgerald, said that your name is George and you are not Duck of Edinburgh.
हाँ ठीक है, तो ये अगर आपने नहीं 10th में आपने वो नहीं पढ़ा है ना, फ्रॉग एंड द नाइटिंगेल?
No, sir.
चेंज हो गया था, चेंज हो गया था, उसमें भी आया था ये डक, ठीक है। तो इट इज अ टाइटल, है ना, एडिनबर्ग इज अ काउंट, कोई एक प्लेस है इन इंग्लैंड, ठीक है। तो जो छोटे छोटे काउंट्स हैं उस तरीके से, ज़्यादा डिटेल में आप थोड़ा सा नेट पे सर्च कर लेना, तो जो वहाँ का प्रिंस या ड्यूक है, ठीक है, उसके लिए ये टाइटल यूज होता है, थोड़ा डिटेल्स आप पढ़ लेना, आपको पता चल जाएगा उसके बारे में। तो वो उसको ये कह रही कि तुम, जैसे हम कहते हैं ना, हम किसी से बात करते वक्त कि यू आर नॉट एन एम्परर ऑफ दैट प्लेस, यू आर नॉट अ किंग ऑफ दैट प्लेस, Similarly, in that way, she is saying that you are not the duck of Edinburgh. तुम कोई बहुत स्पेशल नहीं हो. सीधा सा इसका जो सेंस है वो ये है. Got it?
Yes, sir.
You are not somebody very special. Someone very special. Like that. In that sense, she is saying. ठीक है, तो उसका थोड़ा सा डिटेल कि कहाँ एडिनबर्ग है और किसको बोलते हैं, कि क्या उसका नाम है, ये थोड़ा सा आप लोग एक बार नेट पे देखोगे तो मिल जाएगा. बट द कॉन्टेक्स्ट इज दिस कि यू आर नॉट समवन वेरी स्पेशल, वो उसको बोलती है जॉर्ज पियर्सन को. ठीक है, यू आर जस्ट जॉर्ज पियर्सन. ओम्पी पॉम्पी क्या उसने बोला था, है ना. ठीक है, पॉम्पी पियर्सन कुछ ऐसा बताया था ना उसने इसको, है ना. तो
Pompey,
बिल्कुल
Pompey, yes.
हाँ, है ना. तो तुम कोई बहुत स्पेशल नहीं हो, तुम एक ऑर्डिनरी पर्सन हो, जैसे कोई भी हो सकता है. ठीक है, तो वो उसको, भाई तू अपने लिमिट में रह, अपनी औकात में रह, ज़्यादा उड़ मत. वो उस सेंस में, जो उस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में जब हम बोलते हैं ना, तो वैसे उसने उससे कहा था. ठीक है ना. बाकी
Yes, sir.
उसको थोड़ा सा नेट पे एक बार देख लेना. चलो, एनीथिंग एल्स.